Welcome, everyone. We're so glad you're here. People are still filtering in from the waiting room, but as they're doing that, I'm going to go ahead and get started today. I'm Anna Gassman-Pines, faculty affiliate here at the Duke Center for Child and Family Policy, and we are so glad that you are joining us today for our Early Childhood Initiative seminar series. Before introducing our guest, I have just a few words about logistics. So Professor Bassok will present for about 45 minutes, after which we will open it up for questions for the last 15 minutes of our time together today. You can submit questions at any time through the chat. I will put them into a queue and make sure that they get asked of our speaker at the end of our session. So by way of introduction, our center's Early Childhood Initiative seeks to bring together scholars to address challenges related to early childhood and produce world-class scholarship that helps maximize the potential of all children during the early childhood years. The Early Childhood Initiative seminar series speakers range across disciplines, but share an interest in bringing cutting-edge science to bear on policies affecting young children. It is my pleasure to introduce today's seminar speaker, Dr. Daphna Bassok, Associate Professor of Education and Public Policy at the University of Virginia and Associate Director of EdPolicyWorks, a joint collaboration between the School of Education and Human Development and the Frank Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy. Her research addresses early childhood education policy with a focus on efforts to improve early childhood systems at scale. She is particularly interested in policies aimed at supporting the early childhood workforce. Currently, Dr. Bassok is leading the multi-year evaluation of Virginia's federal preschool development grant Birth Through 5 initiative, which aims to expand access to stable, affordable, and quality early education in for Virginia's families and children, particularly those who are most vulnerable. As part of that evaluation, her team is conducting the first randomized controlled trial measuring the impacts of financial supports for early educators on reducing turnover. Professor Bassok holds a PhD in the economics of education, a master's degree in economics, and a master's degree in policy analysis and evaluation, all from Stanford University. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bassok.
Okay, thank you so much, Anna. I am super excited to be here and to talk to you all. Hopefully you can hear me okay, and I'll just get started. My talk today is called Reducing Teacher Turnover in Early Childhood Education, New Findings from Research Policy Partnerships in Louisiana and Virginia. And these are projects and partnerships we have been working on for a long time. So the talk is meant to highlight some work we've been doing for many years now, but also work that has taken on a lot of urgency and significance during the pandemic. I think people who have come to this talk and who are interested in these topics know that childcare settings have been hit really, really hard by the pandemic, and especially issues of workforce have become incredibly salient. So I will talk a little bit about work we have done and also how it is shaping new work to address kind of the immediate crisis and moving forward. So let's see if I can, all right. So I wanted to start by highlighting that issues of teacher workforce in early childhood have been salient for a really, really long time. They're getting a lot of attention right in this moment because, like I said, the pandemic has hit childcare settings and early childhood very, very hard. But the challenges of being an early educator were salient way before the pandemic hit. And what I'm showing here is an article from 2018 in the New York Times Magazine asking this question: why are our most important teachers paid the least? Highlighting kind of the massive disparities between the work conditions that early educators face relative to teachers working in the K-12 system, and beyond that, particularly difficult working conditions for those working outside of school systems in Head Start programs and in childcare settings. And so this is a question that's been going on for a long time. Why have we built a system in which educators working with 3- and 4-year-olds, those working with infants and toddlers, receive such different kind of work conditions than those working with older kids? And especially as we've kind of understood developmentally how much of an opportunity the early years are and how complex the work is of the early educators in those classrooms, it's become increasingly glaring why we are taking this job that is very complex in this moment that we know is incredibly important for young kids and paying those teachers so little, oftentimes so that they themselves are in poverty and struggling with depression, food insecurities, and a lot of issues like that. So that's been kind of the driving question that has shaped a lot of mine and my team's work over the past few years. And then when COVID hit, it really just took it up a notch. So this is just a picture from 2020 September, so about a year ago in Time magazine, and the headline said COVID-19 has nearly destroyed the childcare industry and it might be too late to save it. So there was this phase at that stage of the pandemic where childcare was often open when schools shut down, putting the workforce, who again was getting paid very little, but was taking on a great deal of risk. But because of safety, because of everything else that was going on with the pandemic, even fewer kids could be served in programs that were already operating on fairly tight margins, making the kind of financial implications on this of the pandemic for small business owners very, very challenging. And as the pandemic has sort of continued, most recently, the narrative has really shifted into this issue of childcare programs not even being able to keep their teachers and or hire new teachers. So this one is just from this month. It says U.S. childcare in short supply as burnt out workers quit and new hires are hard to find. And this woman that is sort of featured in this in the story is early educator from New Orleans, where we do a lot of our work. And it is highlighting how there are so many kids on the wait list right now because she is unable to hire anyone to come in and do the job at the wages that she is able to provide. And so not only is she struggling to serve the kids who are at the site now, they are serving fewer kids than before, not because families don't want the care, not because they can't afford to, but because there aren't people to staff the settings. So the work I'm going to talk about today is primarily work that we started before the pandemic, but obviously hugely connected to current conditions, and I think has huge implications for how we proceed now on issues of kind of workforce compensation. And basically, I have 3 goals for the talk. The first is to highlight just the instability of the early childhood workforce, even sort of pre-pandemic, to highlight what it was before this kind of heightened crisis came about. And then to share with you findings from a large-scale experiment that we have been doing with our partners in Virginia, in which we try to evaluate whether compensation reforms or financial incentive could have a meaningful impact on reducing teacher turnover. And throughout, I'm going to kind of highlight that all this work I'm talking about is work that my team has done in partnership with policymakers in the Virginia Department of Education and the Louisiana Department of Education. It's work that there is no way we could have done without these partnerships. So I hope that in addition to the kind of substantive focus on early educators and turnover and the role of compensation, I can also make a strong pitch for this type of research and what it has allowed us to do in this area where in general, I think it's hard to get good data and to tackle some of these issues. So just to be super explicit, I wanted to call out our partners. The Louisiana Department of Education is my longest research partner. We have been working with their early childhood department since 2013. And a few years back, the woman that was leading their early childhood program, Jenna Conway, moved from the Louisiana Department of Ed to Virginia, where she became the Chief School Readiness Officer for the Commonwealth. And when she did, She was now in our state and said, of course, we should work here too. And that led to another collaboration between my team at UVA, the Virginia Department of Education, and the Virginia Early Childhood Foundation, who is our a nonprofit partner on the ground that helps with a lot of our implementation. So I wanted to call them out because they are a huge piece of this work. And then I also wanted to call out just a subset of my team on the study of early education through partnerships. It's a big team, but these are the ones whose work I'm going to be highlighting today as part of the talk. And I wanted to hopefully specifically call out Laura, who is a Duke alum of this program and one of the postdoctoral fellows working on my team right now. She is totally awesome and led some of the work I'm going to talk about in just 1 second, and is also currently on the job market. And so if you are a person who is excited about this work and would like to hear more about that, Laura would be a good person to contact and hopefully hire. Okay. So the first study I'm going to talk about is called Teacher Turnover in Early Childhood Education, Longitudinal Evidence from the Universe of Publicly Funded Programs in Louisiana. Okay, so as I've said, teacher turnover can be a huge problem. And I think I said it sort of assuming everyone would agree that turnover is problematic, but I want to be really concrete about the many ways that teacher turnover can be problematic. Teacher turnover for the kids in the classroom is disruptive, and for very young children who are extremely reliant on close connections with the adults in their lives, when a teacher leaves, especially mid-year, that could be very disruptive to kids' learning environments. But it also creates a huge problem for the operations of centers, for parents' ability to go to work, and for us as when we think about policy investments, when we think about quality improvement efforts, when you think about doing professional development and coaching teachers, supporting teachers, trying to help teachers improve, and you see teachers leaving at very high rates, the dollars we're putting into those investments are basically just walking out the door. So increasingly, our sense is that improving quality in early childhood education has a first order step of reducing instability. We know from a lot of work that early childhood education is characterized by very low wages and poor working conditions. And this varies a lot across sectors. So when I talk about early childhood as a whole, I'm talking about pre-K programs, Head Start programs, and childcare programs. But in childcare, working conditions are particularly difficult. Many teachers don't even have a high school diploma or have that as their highest level of education. They're earning between $10 and $12 an hour, and many of them themselves are reliant on government assistance programs. And that leads to a huge amount of instability. And people have said that, but actually knowing exactly how much teacher turnover is really, really hard. So I know some of you on this call are people who work with K-12 data, where we have for years now had longitudinal data systems, and you all in your state have one of the best ones where you can really, really track K-12 teachers as they enter their jobs, if they transfer from one site to another, if they exit their jobs. That's all been something that we've tracked and studied very closely in K-12. We don't have anything nearly like that in early childhood because early childhood is incredibly fragmented. Like I said, we have pre-K programs, Head Start programs, childcare programs. Those systems don't communicate with each other very well. And even within systems, within childcare, these are private businesses, and there is no particular way to track teachers as they move across these small and private businesses. So we got very excited with our partners in Louisiana to come up with a way to get around this like huge data problem. And the way we got around it is that since around 2014, Louisiana has rolled out a really unique quality rating and improvement system. Quality rating and improvement systems are early childhood accountability systems, and they are meant to track quality. Most states now have these kinds of systems, but Louisiana's version is really, really unique in that what they do in their system is they go and observe in every single publicly funded classroom, so not just every program, but every classroom, at least twice a year. They go in the fall and they go in the spring and sit in the classrooms and conduct observations to understand the quality in the classrooms. So that's its own thing and is very interesting. And I could give a whole separate talk about this idea of measuring quality so intensively at the state level. But a kind of positive externality of their efforts to collect this data is because they're going in every fall and every spring and observing in every single classroom in childcare, Head Start, and pre-K. We now have this massive data set that allows us to see at each of these time points who were the teachers in these classrooms. So who was the lead teacher that fall, and was that teacher still there in the spring, and what about the next fall, and so on. So in this paper, we leveraged data from the fall of 2016 through the fall of 2019. And we were able to track 5,000, a little over 5,000 teachers in 1,600 sites across Louisiana. And as far as I know, it is the first longitudinal data set that allows people to track teachers in early childhood programs statewide. So basically every teacher working in publicly funded programs should be in our data set. Okay, so I'm going to go quickly through some of the big things we found. The first order thing we found is that turnover in early childhood is just very high compared to any of our expectations from K-12. And so I'm going to show a bunch of figures that look like this. And what they're showing you is the proportion of teachers that were at the sites at the beginning of our data set. That's all of them. That's the sample we observed. And then how many were left at each subsequent time point. So this first point is saying, just looking from the fall of 2016 to the spring of 2017, so that was within one school year, 12% of the teachers left. We only see 88% of the teachers left. At that time point. And then we keep tracking over time, and you can see by the next fall, we are at 65% of the teachers. And so that means that over the period of 1 year, a third of all early childhood educators in Louisiana who were there one fall were no longer there in the spring. And then we continue to track them out all the way out to the fall of 2019. And you can see that by the end of our panel, we've lost 2/3 of the teachers. Okay, so these are very striking turnover rates, just sort of focusing on what we usually report, which is 1 year turnover. We're saying over a third of early educators leave in a year. In K-12, the figures here are varied across states, but we have seen rates around 10, 15, 20%. And so considerably higher than what we see in K-12. Now, one thing you might be wondering, this is turnover from a site. So we also wanted to say, like, okay, is it that they leave their position but move to some other early childhood site, or are they leaving sort of altogether? And so this next line, the red line I'm showing you, is when we look at, do we see you anywhere in our data set? Basically, are you still a teacher somewhere in Louisiana working in early childhood education in a publicly funded program? And the main thing to take away from this is that these lines are quite overlapping. They're very close together, meaning that almost all teachers who leave an early childhood education site in Louisiana are leaving publicly funded early childhood programs altogether rather than transferring from one site to another. So that's the first takeaway, that the turnover is so high. The other really big takeaway from our results is that it varies enormously across sectors. So here, this red line is showing you what happens if we just look at the pre-K teachers, so meaning those teachers in Louisiana that are working in a public school. And the first thing to note is that nearly no teachers leave a public school between the fall and the spring. So within year turnover is incredibly uncommon for public school teachers. About 4% leave during the year, very similar to teachers of older students in the public schools. We lose about a quarter of them by the end of the first year and half of them by the end of the period. If I overlay for you Head Start and childcare, you can see that the results are vastly, vastly different. So in childcare settings, 1 in 5 teachers are gone just between the fall and the spring, meaning when we see a teacher there teaching in the fall as the lead teacher in the classroom, 1 in 5 of those teachers won't even be there when we come back in the spring to try to observe again. When we look one fall later, so one school year ahead, roughly half, 45% of the teachers have exited. And if we look all the way out to the fall of 2019, so 3 years out, 3/4 of the teachers are gone. So a big takeaway for us is that, our fragmented system in which we have pre-K, Head Start, and childcare treated in very different ways, funded in different ways, recruiting very different workforces, leads to very large differences in the instability that we see. And there could be many factors driving why we see these differences, but I wanted to show you one obvious one that should come to mind. Is this potentially about wages? And this is results just from a survey we conducted in Louisiana in some of the parishes where we work most closely, and it's showing you the average wages for lead and assistant teachers working overall and across the different sectors. So focusing on the light blue bars, which are our lead teachers, you can see that overall these wages are quite low. $29,000 a year is the average wage for our full sample, but massive differences across sectors. So the lead teachers working in the childcare settings are earning about $20,000. Those in the schools are earning about twice as much, $40,000, and that is not even accounting for the fact that the school-based teachers typically work for about 10 months, whereas childcare works for 12 months. So huge disparities in wages. Okay. So that descriptive study really drove home a couple of key points for us. Extremely high turnover in early childhood settings. At least in Louisiana, when teachers exit, they almost always leave early childhood publicly funded programs altogether. And the problems we observe are particularly pronounced for teachers working in childcare. 1 in 5 of them are gone just by the spring, and about half of them are gone just 1 year out. So raised kind of the huge problems in childcare, and again, emphasizing that these are have negative implications for kids, but they also have implications for our investments in providing high quality early education in general, and make it very difficult to offer families reliable care. And again, all of this is sort of pre-pandemic, and so highlights that it's only sort of gotten worse in the more recent period. Okay, so that led us to a lot of questions around like, okay, we know it's bad, and how do we start addressing it? And so I'm going to talk a little bit about our experiment, the first year of an RCT we rolled out with our partners in Virginia. This is joint work with Justin Dormal, my former PhD student, now at Brown, as well as Molly and Vivian Wong, some subset of which I think are on this call now. So thank you for coming and listening, and you guys can direct your questions to them. Okay, so like I said, we know the turnover is high. We showed really strong evidence of it. And I think the very kind of obvious response to that is like, we need to find ways to get teachers higher compensation. And there are a lot of challenges around higher compensation for early educators without large public investments, just because of the cost for the sites and the inability to charge families more than we currently do. And so this has led to a lot of kind of conversations, which have grown since the pandemic, around stipends and other potential incentives to support early educators. So these are becoming increasingly popular, but there hasn't been a lot of research yet on the impact of these kinds of things. We have a few studies around kind of what teachers thought of them and how they were rolled out from an implementation perspective, but not so much on the actual impact on the sort of policy relevant outcomes of whether the investment in teacher compensation leads to changes for this workforce. And, we've studied this quite a bit in K-12, and the evidence there is a little bit mixed, but you might think it would be quite different for early educators who, like I said, especially in childcare, are making a lot less. So a while back, this report came out that studied 11 of these programs. that tried to give teachers pay supplements, there was no kind of evaluation in the kind of causal sense of did this have an impact. More the kinds of things that were reported was teachers' just sense of whether this was meaningful for them. So this one is respondents' level of agreement that receiving a bonus influenced their decision to stay in the workforce. And at least based on what teachers said, you can see that like a little bit over half of them said, yeah, getting this bonus led me to stay longer. But what we really wanted to know is to test to what extent that is true. To what extent does giving teachers higher level of compensation matter? I have thought this was an interesting question for a long time in graduate school and beyond, but I had no idea how to tackle it until we had this unique opportunity when Virginia received a $10 million preschool development grant from the federal government with the goal of unifying and strengthening early childhood education. So this is our First Lady in Virginia and our key partner, Jenna Conway, who is the head of the program. And she rolled out this idea for how they were going to spend out the $10 million. And one of the things that was the most interesting, or the part that got our team the most excited, is when we read the press release and saw the piece that said nearly $4 million of this funding will directly support early childhood educators with the idea of reducing turnover and improving quality. So that seemed really, really cool. And we went to our partner and said, like, what does that mean? How are you going to give them the money? What are you going to do? And so we knew there was about $4 million to give away. We wanted to make something called a recognition program. And the idea, the underlying premise she had in mind was we give these teachers these resources because they are taking on so much. We need to reduce stress. We need to improve well-being, improve in turn teacher-child interactions, and hopefully increase the likelihood teachers stay at their site. So this was kind of like, we hoped that in all these ways, giving teachers access to resources would matter. There were a huge number of choices to make in a very short amount of time. For those of you, I know some of you have worked in North Carolina on the PDG. For those of you who rolled it out, the first year was very fast. You had to use all the funds within 12 months. I wish it was 12 years. That would have been a more calm way to roll out the study, but we had 12 months and we wanted to find a way to deliver these incentives and see if it worked. So there were a lot of these questions like, who's going to get the incentives? Is it just for lead teachers? Is it for assistant teachers? What about directors? Like, who's going to get them? How much should the incentives be? Like, we have $4 million. We could give it to more people, but give them less money, or give them to fewer people, but more money. So who gets it and how big were the incentives were like two of the biggest questions to figure it out. But then the questions that our team was the most probably persistent on is, okay, and how do we study this so that we get real evidence on the impact of the financial supports? How can we roll it out in a way where we can learn how this mattered? And luckily, our partners agreed to give it a shot, and we ultimately ended up doing two different experiments, which I will now sort of talk through. But the basic details of the program was we landed on $1,500 financial incentives. We actually wanted to start with $2,000 because that would work out to about a dollar an hour raise, but we didn't have the resources to go all the way. So this ended up being for median childcare teacher about a 75-cent raise per hour, tied to retention at a specific PDG site. So the way it worked is, if you were any early childhood teacher working directly with kids, a teacher, an assistant, and an aide, a floater, anyone working at least 30 hours a week directly with kids at one of the sites participating in the PDG, and this was childcare, Head Start, pre-K, and actually also family childcare homes, though I won't talk about them in the presentation today, you could receive up to $1,500 if you remained in your site over a roughly 8-month period. we started the PDG with 25 Virginia cities and counties that were participating, and all publicly funded ECE programs were invited to participate, though not all did. It was voluntary at that point. So we got the pool of all the programs at those sites, and we had enough money to, we hoped, give all the teachers in those 25 Virginias and cities and counties who opted to participate the $1,500 incentive. But then, right as we were rolling out, a very large urban county was also interested in participating in the PDG. And they were large, and we didn't have enough money to fully add that county on. And so that led us to see if we could potentially use that as a place where we could do some randomization. And since we did not have resources to include all of them, we spent some time talking with the leaders in that county to see if maybe there we could randomize who did and did not have access to the recognition program, which again was just one component of our PDG. Okay, so we ended up with two experiments. The first, study one, which is the one I'll talk about today, is just what is the impact of the offer of a financial incentive on teacher retention. So this was in that one urban county where we couldn't serve everyone. We got programs to volunteer to participate. They knew that some in the PDG, and they knew that some would and some would not have access to the recognition program, and that would be assigned randomly. We ended up with 75 sites and roughly 584 teachers in that sites, and we randomized at the site level. So there would never be a case where in a particular site, one teacher had access to the recognition program and one did not. And so for those that were selected to receive the program, they could get up to $1,500 at roughly 3 months, a little less than 3 months intervals. They would get $500 if they were still at their site. And then if about 3 months later they were still at their site, they got another $500. And if at the end of the period, which again was about 8 months total, they were still there, they got the final payment for up to $1,500 total. And our comparison group did not have access to the program at all. So it was just kind of business as usual, getting paid what they would have been paid anyway. We also had a second experiment we did in all the rest of our communities. And remember, in the rest of the communities, everybody had access to $1,500. Everybody was automatically eligible. There we had 340 sites, 1,927 teachers. And since everybody was getting the funds, we could not test whether the funds did or did have an impact. But what we did test was whether the timing of the funds made a difference. And here we were interested, does it matter if we pay the teachers in 3 payments of $500, like I laid out for the first study, or give them $1,500 just at the very end? And the reason that was a really policy relevant question for us is that our state partners don't have a great way to get teachers money. Like ideally, our thought was that ideally we want to increase paychecks on a weekly or bi-weekly basis, but we have no ways to do that. The main lever a state actually has to get money to teachers is through things like tax cuts, which would happen annually. But our question was, does that work with this very low income workforce? Does waiting the full 8 months have the same impact as getting some of the resources to teachers faster? And that was kind of the purpose of that second experiment. All right, so I'll tell you a little bit about our sample for study one, and I know we don't have a ton of time, so I'll go a little bit fast, but you can see we had in that first urban county where we did the study, we have a pretty diverse sample. About a quarter of our sample was white, 20% Black, quarter Hispanic. They are range in their experience levels, and overall 82% of that sample, about 18% of them were employed 8 months later, like verified to still be there and still eligible for getting the recognition program. So that is kind of the overall, but as I sort of highlighted at the beginning, it highlights huge, huge differences in who these teachers were across sites. So just looking at the lead teachers, you can see that the racial compositions of the teachers is quite different. The lead teachers working in the childcare center were far less likely to be white than the lead teachers working in the public schools. They also had very different levels of education. So about half of our lead teachers in the childcare centers had bachelor's degrees compared to all lead teachers working in the school. And you can see they also had very different wages, roughly half as much, where the teachers earned about $35,000 as lead teachers in the childcare settings compared to twice that much in the public schools. And so it's not surprising that then we also saw quite different likelihood of still being at your site. When we came back at the 8 months point in the public schools, we had lost about 4% of the teachers compared to overall roughly 17% of the lead teachers. And then if you add into that we also had everyone else working at the site directly with kids, the assistant teachers, they were the least likely to be white teachers. They had the lowest levels of education, and they also had the lowest pay and the highest turnover rate. So quite a diverse group across roles and settings. Okay, so our first order question before we even did the experiment is how much does pay matter? And this is just showing you for childcare teachers, what is the difference in turnover rates depending on the pay at your site. So this isn't the difference between childcare and pre-K. This is just childcare teachers. If we look at how much your site pays you, is there a relationship, just an association between pay and turnover? And you can see there is. I'm going to go fast so we can definitely see the experimental results. But you can see that overall, for Virginia childcare workers, those in the kind of lowest wage quartile, the dark green bars, are likely to leave their site at twice the rate of those in the highest wage bar, the yellow bars. And this one is showing this to you for the whole state. But if we look just within each county, that still holds, including in the county where we did the experiment. So it's definitely the case that the pay was correlated with the turnover, but pay could be correlated with a lot of things. So we really wanted to get to the experiment, and did offering this incentive matter? So let me show you our main results. This light blue bar that you can see right now is our comparison group. And what it shows you is for the whole sample. So this is like Head Start, pre-K, childcare, lead teachers, assistant teachers. In the control group, meaning for those sites where you were not offered the recognition program, roughly a quarter of teachers in our control group were no longer teaching at their site by the time we looked 8 months out. All right. So then this dark blue bar shows you what happened for those teachers in the teacher recognition program. And you can see that among those teachers in sites that offered the recognition program, turnover rates were 86%, meaning there was about an 11 percentage point difference in the likelihood of still being at your site. Okay, so that's a large difference across groups, but it masks considerable variation because we already showed you at the beginning that very few of the school-based teachers left their site. There wasn't even a turnover issue to speak of in pre-K programs in these communities. So we also wanted to look at this across sectors. So here's what it looked like for childcare centers compared to school-based teachers. And again, these light blue bars I'm showing you right now are just showing what it looked like in the control group, where teachers were not offered the recognition program. And of course, the striking thing is those are quite different for schools and centers. So 30% of childcare teachers working in childcare centers were gone over 8 months compared to around 6% of the teachers working in the control schools in the public schools. And now adding in the treatment group, you can see that for the public schools, pretty much nothing happened. 93% of the teachers in the control group remained, and 93% of the teachers in the treatment group remained. But for childcare centers, we got huge results. Basically, the turnover rate over an 8-month period for the control group is 30% of teachers leaving. For the treatment group, it's 15%, meaning we cut turnover rates in half in those communities with this $1,500 incentive. When we look at this separately for the lead teachers and assistant teachers within childcare programs, you can see that the result is driven primarily by the assistant teachers, who, like I said, got paid the least and had the least experience in our sample. And you can see that for them, the change was nearly or just over 24 percentage points in the likelihood that they left their site. And then we spent a bunch of time also surveying the teachers to try to understand what this did for them and how they used the money. And so by far, both kind of on our survey responses and in the written comments, what came through is that the main thing teachers did with these funds is use them towards immediate and basic necessities. The things that came up the most are housing, food, and bills. So 83% of the teachers reported using funds that way, and the next most comment was paying off debts. And we have a lot of write-in comments from the teachers about exactly what this did for them. I remember the day teachers started receiving their checks, and there was such a buzz of excitement. I know for one of the teachers, receiving that check meant she could finally make necessary car repairs after having an accident. I know all of the teachers who were eligible appreciated it, and it definitely made an impact on how long they continued to work. And so we saw these kind of two pieces of kind of getting basic needs met, as well as this sense of appreciation that was very salient in lots of the comments, where teachers said, I've never as an early educator received something like this. The last one I'll highlight is, thank you. Early educators are so often left out of the conversation when it comes to teaching. This grant has shown that our work matters. I'm hopeful that one day being respected and recognized for what we do will be a norm in our society. So to sort of summarize the findings from the RCT, we, I think, provide the first and really compelling evidence that financial incentives have kind of a causal impact on turnover, and we showed that within childcare in this community, the $1,500 recognition program cut turnover rates in half, from 30% of teachers leaving their site to 15%. And across the board, both thinking about the big comparison to pre-K as well as within roles, it appears that the teachers who faced the greatest instability, the highest turnover, had lower wages and benefited the most from access to it. So to sort of wrap up, I wanted to say some things about policy implications and where we're headed with this, and then how the partnerships have really benefited us in being able to do this work and in being able to see how this work can feed right back into policy. So I think the issues of stability and inequities in the facing the workforce have been long-standing issues, but they were really exacerbated by COVID, and also the public interest in these topics and the urgency of addressing childcare also became really salient for many parents as they were facing COVID restrictions. And so I think we had both a very challenging situation, but also very kind of heightened, renewed interest in addressing these problems. So I think there are immediate policy implications around just needing to get resources out to childcare programs and addressing staffing problems, and thinking about how to deal with kind of the crisis that is currently in place around how to get sites back and staffed up. But there's also kind of the longer term questions. And so with COVID relief dollars, we got the American Rescue Plan, which invested a lot in childcare relief, and the Build Back Better Act is currently being sort of debated and would create unprecedented investments in early childhood programs, with a particular focus on, yes, pre-K, yes, expanding pre-K for 3 and 4 year olds, but also a very explicit focus on childcare, ensuring it is affordable to families, and that providers get the resources they need to pay their workforce. So I think it's an incredibly challenging time, but also an exciting time to think about how to sort of reimagine an early childhood system that really works for all families, and also for the providers, and especially the teachers themselves. And I think the questions that become really interesting now are not so much like, can money matter in this sector, where I think it's just so obvious that the resources could matter. It's how do we best leverage leverage these dollars? How do we roll out recognition programs? Like, our study may have shown that the money matters, but what do we do long-term to ensure pay for teachers aside from this sort of one-off program we were able to do with temporary federal funds? We are working on a lot of research to try to tackle some of these questions. In Virginia, we're trying to look at a lot of mechanisms, trying to understand the extent to which the dollars we gave to teachers impacted things before the turnover point, things like teacher stress, depression, well-being, things that spiked quite a bit during the pandemic. And we are also doing a bunch of new RCTs, trying to understand the exact mechanisms that matter, how the timing matters. I didn't talk about the results of our timing experiment, but they basically highlighted that getting the money sooner in 3 payments was more effective in reducing turnover than waiting for the large payment at the end of the year. So thinking about how do we get money to teachers quicker. And in Louisiana, similar related work, trying to understand, okay, we now have dollars from the recovery grants. We need to get them to teachers, but how do we get money directly into the hands of teachers as a state when really our mechanism is to give childcare providers money? And how do we get those dollars to not just go to the center, but to go to the teachers and go into compensation? And then finally, how do any of these things impact not just the turnover, but the quality that kids are experiencing and the impact our investments in early education are having for kids? All right, this is my last slide, and I think we're right about at time, but I wanted to specifically call out the benefits of doing this work through partnership. The first study I showed around tracking just how salient turnover is for childcare is something we would absolutely have never known existed if we had not been partnering with the state and understanding their QRIS data, and the fact that it created this unprecedented opportunity to track early educators over multiple years and see their movements. And without this kind of long-standing relationship with our partners in Virginia, there is just no way we would have gone to an RCT that allowed us to test the impact of these programs. And what we've done over time is, I think, tried to think about how the data from the partnership and the work we're doing can inform sort of large questions that are relevant not just for our state partners, but nationally as we try to work on improving early childhood systems, while also trying to really explicitly help our partners get the work that they're doing done. We know for sure that in Virginia, our RCT results from the first year of the study were something that our partner was able to take into the governor and into a legislative session during COVID, so that we were able to, at a time when lots of funding was being cut, ask for an expansion to meet the federal dollars that we continue to have from the PDG program with supplementary state funds, so that not only could we continue the teacher recognition program for more time, we could include more teachers, and we could increase the amount from $1,500 to $2,000 in recognition of the hardship teachers were in under the pandemic. And in Louisiana, similarly, we helped them design what is now their teacher support grants, which are components of the recovery dollars that are flagged specifically to address compensation. And we are working with them to study under what conditions those investments are getting straight to teachers. So just an example of sort of how we've partnered with LDOE and the Virginia Department of Ed and VECF to try to both answer these questions that I think are timely and important nationally, but also help them in the immediate work they're doing, trying to support their teachers. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daphna, for a really interesting presentation. I'm so excited we got to see some of the results of the RCT. We have questions coming in for the chat, and I encourage those of you who haven't put your questions in the chat yet to do that now, so that we can make sure we get them asked. The first question is, could you talk a little bit about, based on your work and others, what the implied benefits of these RCT results are for children's development? So do you think that incentivized teachers teach better and have children who learn more, or is it really just coming through kind of staying in the profession, so same quality teaching, but that lasts longer? Can you just talk a little bit about kind of the implications for child development?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's really important. And in some ways, we could see like I said at the beginning, a set of mechanisms that we think matter here, right? And there are a couple of these things. There are the direct impacts and on teachers' mental health that we are tracking now, where we know that teachers who are experiencing these levels of poverty, their stress levels are very, very high. In our Virginia data, the spike in teacher stress during the pandemic was massive. So, and we know, from your work, Anna, around kind of the impact for this workforce of stress. And so I think there is really strong evidence around how teachers' mental health is related to the kinds of interactions they have with young children. And so there is a way in which we think the resources directly and the reduction in stress sort of immediately from having these resources could immediately impact the interactions teachers have with their kids and how much kids are learning in a classroom. And that would be sort of the direct effect. I think there's also there's like kind of a huge number of other things that happen beyond the direct effects for teachers. So one of them is kind of the disruptions to the operations of a site when teachers leave, taking the director's focus on filling those spots, but also potentially creating a lot of work for the other teachers who are left behind, and sort of a reshuffling and maybe moving kids around to meet ratios. And so the kind of disruptions that then happen when you're trying to get another person there can have direct implications for kids too. Like all of a sudden your peer group has changed, or you have another person in the room, and we know the attachment for kids is really important. So we do have evidence. One of our collaborators, Anna Markowitz, has done a bunch of work in Head Start looking at what happens for kids when there is a within year teacher exit. And we can see that for any one of these mechanisms I just said, we do see kids learn less in classrooms where a teacher leaves mid-year and gets replaced. And then beyond that, there is just the kind of investments in teachers getting better over time. So Laura on our team is doing a bunch of really interesting work now that hasn't happened before in early childhood, just looking at how teachers improve over time. And we know in K-12, there's this huge piece around like the first year is terrible, it's hard, and then you get better and you improve over your first few years. We've never really looked at that in early childhood, but Laura's results sort of show really steep learning curves. So if we're losing teachers at the moment where they stand to learn the most, these investments in kind of like human capital development and in teachers getting better are lost over time as well. So I think there are just kind of a set of ways in which these kind of disruptions both immediately could impact kids, but also make it very hard to create high quality programs.
Thanks. One of our participants is wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about the early child care and education settings in these two states. So in particular, what counts as a public program in Louisiana? Does it include childcare providers serving children on subsidies? Does it include childcare providers providing public pre-K? And then kind of a similar question for Virginia. So if you could just talk a little bit more about the details of the settings in those two states.
Yeah, totally. That's a great question. So in Louisiana, when we are saying publicly funded programs, what we mean is any program that receives public dollars, whether it's a pre-K program that is directly funded, a Head Start program that receives federal funds, or a subsidized, any childcare program that serves kids who are receiving subsidies. And so those are our three groups. There's a lot of complexity, and a lot of times they braid those different funding streams, but basically, the results for childcare are essentially private businesses who are accepting childcare subsidies, usually federal subsidies. In the Virginia results, we have, it's very similar. So again, we are including in the PDG any sites that receive any public dollars, which for childcare and for family childcare homes, which both are included, it means they are taking subsidies, at least for some of their kids in their sites. That's a condition of being part of the preschool development grant. The only sort of like glitchy thing about the way I presented the results here is that Virginia in the PDG includes in the kind of childcare sites any Head Start programs that are serving kids in community-based settings, and puts the Head Starts in schools if they are located in the school-based setting. So when I compared school versus centers, Head Start was sort of in both of those groups, but we've also looked at the results just sort of taking Head Start out of the equation, and the results are, even more salient because Head Start, as I showed you in all the figures, are kind of right in the middle. Like they are traditionally getting paid less than what we see teachers getting paid if they are in the public school system, but considerably more than what teachers get paid in private childcare settings.
Thanks. So another question is about, it's an external validity question, but in an interesting way, which is, could you speculate a little bit about whether increasing just straight up wages by 75 cents an hour would have the same retention effect that you find in your Virginia experiment? That is, how much of this is kind of the wage, the hourly wage that these folks get paid versus, and the money that they have versus a feeling of kind of, reward and appreciation that the lump sum might be providing. And then if you're open-ended, if any of your open-ended survey questions give you any insight there.
It's a really good question, and we don't know the answer really. I mean, we don't in the study know the answer. I can talk about how we're thinking about it, where, ultimately we are in a situation where we did the study in large part as a proof of concept to have very concrete evidence on whether the money had this impact. And like I said, our hypothesis was that the mechanism would be stronger if people access the resources faster, like if we got it to teachers. And the thing we were trying to sort of replicate is adding it to their paycheck, but we just can't. Like the amount of work that our partner did to even make 3 payments was incredibly burdensome because we first had to verify that each teacher was still there, which was kind of like a large data collection effort, and then send out the checks. So 3 was kind of like at the time the biggest thing they were willing to do. This past year, they let us, because we saw that the 3 payments definitely led to bigger benefits than the 1 payment at the end, they let us do a second randomization. This year, we randomized 3 payments versus 6 payments. And so that's getting a little closer, and I don't know the answer yet. And it's also going to be a little bit of a mess because it happened during COVID, and it happened at a time where teachers were getting all sorts of unemployment, but also other kinds of federal supports. And so it's a little hard to say, but that the premise was like, is it better to get it as close as possible in there? We also were very curious if the mechanism is primarily through how much the appreciation, which definitely was a huge piece of what teachers wrote about, and this sense that they mattered and their work was getting noticed, especially by the state. If there was something that was more psychological about it than the resources, I mean, my short answer is I don't think that's the driving force of what we're getting, but we also did a set of experiments this year where we were texting teachers in large part because we worried that, our communication stream in general is from the state to the providers, not to the teachers themselves. So we wanted to make sure teachers super understood how it worked and how to get their money, but we added a little add-on condition where for one set of teachers, we just ramped up the appreciation. There was just a lot of appreciation in addition to just the message, getting them the resources. And so again, that's just from this past year, and I don't know the answer yet, but I think it'll help us to isolate how much of it is kind of this external recognition versus the money itself.
Right. Well, I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative to ask the last question. I do want to just point out that Erica Lako, our fantastic events coordinator here, has put several very helpful links in the chat to Dr. Bassok's working papers and other relevant working papers. So be sure to click those now so that you can get access to those, because I know there were some questions coming through about getting access to working papers. So for the final question, one thing that I found was really interesting is this difference for assistant teachers versus lead teachers. And again, I was hoping you might talk a little bit more about what you think that is. Is it that they are just particularly poorly paid, so it's purely about wages, or is there also something there unique about their kind of work circumstances where this recognition payment really seemed to make a big difference for the assistant teachers? I think it's a crucially important group that we just don't hear a lot about kind of really pulled out separately. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, that is something we are really wondering about too. So a few things, like, we pre-registered the study and we asked it this way because the role is different and the pay is different. So when we said, like, which cuts are we going to do, this was one of them. But what we have seen since, both in Louisiana and Virginia, is that the turnover rates are so vastly higher among first-year teachers than they are among teachers at any other point. Like, conditional on staying to a second year, turnover rates go way, way down. And so one of the things about the result that we're trying to sort of tease out is that our assistant teachers are much more likely to be the new teachers, the newest teachers in the sample. They're much more likely to be first-year teachers than the lead teachers. And so part of it could be something around just that, like, you're new to the job and you're figuring it out, and it's particularly uniquely hard, so that the money means more and that it's more of an experience story than it is a role story. Other than that, it could also be the things you said, where it's the pay is worse. I think in some ways the work is harder. They are moving around a lot more, and from, like, our survey responses about kind of the work of assistant teachers, I think they are under a lot of pressure. They're often have the least education, the least supports going into the job, and they're often excluded from a lot of, like, the way we do professional development, in that we focus on lead teachers in classrooms. So a lot of, like, our efforts to create mentors or give coaches are focused on the lead teachers. We don't yet have a good way to sort of tease that out and say what of those things led to the result we saw here, but it does raise questions about how we support those teachers. And I was also going to say, I know we didn't get to everyone's questions, but if people have other questions and want to email or follow up, I'm very happy to do that as well.
Well, thank you so much, Daphna, for being here and for a terrific talk. And many thanks to all of you who attended our event today. We do welcome your feedback, which will help us at the center continue to improve our events. Erica has shared a link to a very short survey in the chat, and we would really appreciate it if you would take a few minutes to share your opinions and feedback. And before we close, I'd just like to announce that our next Early Childhood Series speaker is Dr. Tiffany Green, an assistant professor in the Departments of Population Health Sciences and Obstetrics and Gynecology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She will be talking about structural racism and racial ethnic disparities in desired pregnancies on October 28th. You'll see a link for more information on that talk in the chat. We hope you can join us for another terrific talk at the end of next month. And thank you again, Dr. Bassok, for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me. It was so fun.